global credit ratings agency S&P has downgraded Kenya to a B- from a B, marking the third such demotion since June this year. And this latest downgrade comes after similar actions by Fitch and Moody's. Pundits are now pushing for African countries to develop their own credit scoring frameworks. To unpack this and much more, CNBC Africa is now joined live by Dr. Daouda Sembene, who is an economist and CEO Africa Catalyst. For more, Sembene, thank you so much for joining us. Quite a lot we are seeing here, the impact of credit rating downgrade on Kenya. How are we likely to see this downgrade to a B negative affect Kenya's economy and also access to international capital? And also, what can other African nations learn from what Kenya is going through?
Well, thank you very much for having me. Indeed, the recent decision by S&P to downgrade Kenya's credit rating to B- from B has been quite expected, because it follows similar decision from other credit rating agencies, including Fitch and Moody's, following the withdrawal of the tax bill. So it's a critical decision that would have very much significant impacts. First of all, it would certainly deteriorate the market and investors' confidence. And I think this will also have some implication on the cost of borrowing that Kenya is facing when it tries to access a global capital market. So ultimately, of course, this type of decision could very much have a critical effect on the ability of the country to boost economic performance going forward. What lessons can other African countries learn, countries that are in similar fiscal situation as Kenya? I think there are many lessons. First of all, I think when you talked about countries that are in similar situation, you're talking about countries that are very much facing tight fiscal situations. Those countries certainly will need to continue to sort of try to see to what extent they can ease their fiscal stance by implementing what is called fiscal consolidation policies. But I think from the experience of learning of Kenya, they would learn to really do so by adopting very credible and sound and prudent policies to address their debt vulnerabilities. It means that you need to look at what is the composition of the policy mix, what is the sequencing of the reform that you want to implement, and of course, trying also to get as much financing as you can at low cost possible. And of course, it also means that they need to be more proactive in terms of communication and trying to secure more social and political support to the reform agenda.
And we have quite a lot there on navigating debt distress. We are already seeing around or about 22 African countries at risk of debt distress. But let us talk about the UNDP and Africa Catalyst launching a credit ratings initiative on navigating credit ratings in Africa. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit on this.
Well, indeed, I think what we have noticed is, I think there is an issue with the engagement of African countries with credit rating agencies. And I think the issue is actually sort of both from both parts, in the sense that I think there is a need for very much understanding what are the credit rating methodologies that are used and that are actually sort of applied to African countries. If you remember last year, the UNDP came up with a study that estimated that African countries could have saved 74 billion if credit rating methodologies used by credit rating agencies were less subjective. So what it means is there is certainly some scope for both parties to engage proactively and constructively to understand each other and to see to what extent, of course, credit ratings agencies can continue to do the work they need to do, which is critical for mobilizing capital to Africa, but at the same time doing it in an objective way without necessarily sort of undermining the efforts by African countries to attract investors and fund their development. So I think what Africa Catalyst and the UNDP has been doing recently to really support this type of engagement is to convene African government officials to help them better understand what is the credit rating processes that big credit rating agencies are using and how they can really very much understanding and very much proactively engage with those agencies in a way to really understand what are the prerequisites for improving their credit ratings. And we have done also last month in Tanzania.
Yes.
We are also going to do it also next week in Addis Ababa for a number of countries in the regions there.
All right, and away from that, let us talk about some of the options that are available to Kenya specifically, looking at addressing fiscal imbalances here, leading to such downgrades.
I think the options, of course, are quite limited in many ways, because when you are facing a debt crisis, or when you're at high risk of debt distress, as the IMF and the World Bank would actually qualify, the first thing is to try to get in the short run some liquidity to ease the liquidity pressure that the country is facing, which means that I think, and Kenya has already done so, you may actually go and engage with some multilateral institutions, whether it's the World Bank or the IMF, where you can get affordable financing in the short run. But I think over time, I think the solution would also be to see to what extent countries like Kenya can access the global capital market at lower cost. I think this is the key issue that needs to be solved. It means, of course, on the part of the government, they need to do more effort to really implement credible and sustainable fiscal policies, but also macro policies in general. It also means from credit rating agencies that they need to implement and use objective methodologies and engage proactively with the African countries. At the same time, also, I think there is, of course, scope for all stakeholders, domestic and external, who can support the African countries in really very much strengthening their policy framework, strengthening also, of course, their data collection and dissemination procedures, so that they can also, of course, be able to improve their rating. I think this is the agenda that we at Africa Catalyst and UNDP are very much engaged and very much trying to see to what extent we can support that in African countries in this process.
And yes, indeed, thank you so much, Daouda. It is also quite viable for the agencies to, at the same time, adapt their, the methodologies rather, to better reflect the current realities you're seeing when it comes to African countries. So let us end that conversation there. Thank you so much for those great insights.